This is Shelton cassette number 30, a talk given by Dr. Herbert M. Shelton at St. Louis, Missouri in 1960.
My favorite doctor and your favorite lecturer, Dr. Herbert M. Shelton. Thank you, Mr. Doolin. This evening, I'm to talk to you on a subject that for some reason or other we have neglected in the past. I do not believe that we have talked on this subject at any of our subsequent, or rather any of our previous conventions. And yet it is, and especially in the present time is it, a very important subject, that of the relation of natural hygiene to what we know as mental and physical, mental and nervous diseases. Since man began to think, and sometimes I wonder if he has been trying to understand mind. In the past, and to a large extent even in the present, he has tried to understand mind disassociated from the human constitution. Philosophers, metaphysicians, and the older psychologists studied mind in the abstract. They looked upon it as something independent of the body, some kind of an entity that was so superior to the physical body that it hardly had any connection with it. It was Aristotle, I believe, who first suspected that the brain was the seat of the human intellect. But it was just the intellect and not the rest of those functions that we know as mental functions that he associated with the brain. The heart and the liver and the spleen and other organs of the trunk were regarded as seats of the various emotions. And when in the Bible there is the statement that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, you must keep in mind in reading that the man who wrote that statement and the people to whom he addressed it actually believed that the thinking was done with the heart. It was not a figure of speech. It was intended to be taken literally at that time. It was not until Gall, nearly 200 years ago, proved that the brain is the organ of the mind that a real study of the physiology of the mind could begin. Now, Gall is a man whose name is rarely mentioned. They're beginning to mention him a little bit more now in scientific literature than they have in the past, because in addition to his great studies of the structure and functions of the brain, he devised a system that he called craniology, which later became known as phrenology, which was an effort to delineate human character and determine what men and women were fitted for by examination of the cranium. It was a very plausible, a very captivating theory as he and his co-workers worked it out. But it finally became regarded as a form of quackery. And the psychologist who had previously held the field came back to take over. Nonetheless, the study of the function of the brain, or the functions of the brain, has continued, and a great part of what Gall taught has been demonstrated to be true. Now, among the things that he taught was that the brain is not an organ, but a whole series of organs. And while today we do not speak of brain organs as he did, we speak of brain centers, each center having its own specific function to perform, and no center performing the function of any other. It is due to the fact that we have these different brain centers, each of which performs its own particular function, that damage to one part of the brain produces one kind of trouble, and damage to another part of the brain produces another type of trouble. When once we realize that the brain is the organ of the mind, and without the brain there is no mental action, we can readily understand that aberrations of the mind, or of mental function, have their seat or have their origin in disease of the brain. Disease of the brain means insanity, or paralysis, or idiocy, or some other type of trouble, depending upon the type and the location of the physical disturbance of that congeries of organs. There is only one other organ in the human body that rivals the brain in its number of functions, and that is the skin. Perhaps you had not thought of the skin as an organ, but it is. It's actually the largest organ in the body and serves many functions. But to get back to our brain, anything that injures in any way that brain will impair mental function. We see delirium in fever. We see positive insanity in drunkenness, whether it's alcoholic drunkenness or some other type. We see confusion and even the abolition of consciousness in narcosis and in anesthesia. And we see confusion of mental function in the individual who is recovering from a state of narcosis or a state of anesthesia. And we know that there are many drugs, such, for example, as the sulfa drugs that had a great vogue but a few years ago, that produce positive insanity and drive people to suicide. The sleeping pills of various kinds, and opium or morphine, and various other types of drugs that have been used extensively in the past, have been responsible for great numbers of cases of mental derangement and of insanity of one type or another. Hardening of the arteries in the brain that cuts off the blood supply to the brain results in impairment of mental function, results in a gradual deterioration of the mind of the individual. Within the last few years, the medical profession has come up with the discovery that insanity can be produced by drugs. Most of the world has known it for a long time. And they are looking around for more and more drugs with which they can produce insanity. For some reason or other, they think that if they can find drugs that will produce insanity, they can ultimately find drugs that will remedy insanity. This, of course, is a resort to their common practice of ignoring causes and trying to force organs to behave normally by some kind of violent means. it is not logical to think that if drugs will produce insanity, drugs will also remedy insanity. It is more logical to think that if drugs will reproduce insanity, the way to get rid of the insanity is to get away from the drugs. The way to prevent insanity is not to take the drugs. Instead of that, we live in an age and in a time and in a place in which more and more and more poisoning is being constantly introduced into the human organism. Not merely in the form of tobacco and alcohol and tea and coffee and cocoa and chocolate and antacids and headache remedies, so-called, and constipation remedies of one kind or another, and the prescriptions of the physicians, and their vaccines and their serums and their alleged medicines, but also in the forms of additives to our foods, adulterants, preservatives, coloring matters, and in the forms of sprays that are sprayed upon the foods in the orchard, and in the forms of those of you who are foolish enough to make graveyards of your stomach and bury dead animals in them, in the forms of gland extracts and preservatives. The gland extracts that are added are fed to the animals, and the preservatives that are added to the animal food after the animal is killed. Those of you who eat flesh may be reasonably sure that you're eating embalmed flesh. All of these sources of poison are everyday sources in our culture today. You get them in everything and from all sides. Now, it is not likely that there is any poison that can be taken into the human body in any considerable quantity, or that may be taken over a considerable period of time, that does not involve the brain and the nervous system in its effects. Any of them. And at this point, I want to stop and go back a minute and point out to you something that I neglected to say a while ago. And that is that what we call mental diseases and nervous diseases are not different in any particular, except in their symptoms, from the diseases that we call physical diseases. The liver and the nervous system are just as physical. They're just as much a part of the human body as the liver or the lungs. And I believe I said the liver or the nervous system when I should have said the brain or the nervous system, are physical organs. They're just as physical and just as much a part of the body as the liver, the lungs, the kidneys, the heart, or any other organ that you may name. They are physical. And any disturbance of their function, any impairment of these organs that gives rise to mental and nervous symptoms is just as much a physical disease as disease of the liver. And the toxins of the bloodstream, or the poisons that you introduce from without, that affect the liver, or the kidneys, or the bladder, or the stomach, or any other organ, or any other tissue of the body, also affect equally detrimentally the brain and the nervous system. So that any toxic state arising in the body from a checking of elimination may just as likely produce so-called mental disease as physical disease. Another common source of physical and mental impairment is food deficiency. In some of the marked deficiencies like pellagra and beriberi, in the advanced stages, very severe mental diseases develop. The patients become actually insane. Long before that period is reached, mental symptoms appear and nervous symptoms. In beriberi, for example, which is just another name for multiple neuritis, there are plenty of nervous symptoms, and there is plenty of involvement of the nervous system. So that the same causes, the same poisoning from without, the same toxic states arising within, the same food deficiencies that result from our habit of eating only processed and refined foods that produce the diseases of the other organs of the body are also responsible for diseases of the brain and nervous system. When we know the causes that produce our troubles, we are in a position to do something about the trouble. Because, as we have pointed out before, I believe the first night I was here, the first requisite in recovery of health, irrespective of the symptom complex with which the patient suffers, irrespective of the name that may be attached to that symptom complex, and irrespective of the complexity of that symptom complex, the first requisite of the recovery of health is the removal of the causes that are producing and maintaining the trouble. It is just as foolish to attempt to remedy what we call mental diseases without removing their causes as it is to attempt to sober up a drunk man while he continues to drink. All of the causes, not part of the causes that are impairing health and that are producing and maintaining the impairment of health, must be removed. After causes have been removed, or coincident with the removal of causes to a certain extent, it is essential that the body be supplied with adequate quantities, or with quantities within its capacity to utilize them, of all of the primordial requisites of normal organic existence. This means, of course, that the body must be supplied with the proper kind of food. It must be supplied with pure air and fresh air and pure water, and with sunshine, and with rest and sleep, and with exercise. In other words, with the elements of health, with the elements of livingness. This is not the way that mental cases are handled. Not too far from my institution, there is another institution. It is run by a couple of medical men who are specialists in mental and nervous diseases. People are brought there with their nervous troubles and their light mental troubles, and some of them are fairly rational at the time they arrive, but they can't sleep well. Or at night time they become noisy. By the time they're 2 or 3 weeks, they're climbing the walls. They're drugged to keep them quiet. They're drugged to put them to sleep. Now, nobody in all of history ever went to sleep from taking a drug. A drug-induced unconsciousness is not sleep. You might just as well hit them over the head with a club and refer to that unconsciousness as sleep as to refer to the unconsciousness that results from poisoning as sleep. It is not sleep, and the person who is unconscious from having been drugged is not deriving the benefits from that period of unconsciousness that he derives from sleep. But they give them these drugs to keep them quiet, to keep them unconscious, and the more they're given, the more the brain and nervous system are impaired, the worse the condition becomes, and then after a time they resort to another form of treatment which is even worse in its effects upon the patient. The worse the condition becomes, and then after a time they resort to another form of treatment which is even worse in its effects upon the patient. The so-called shock treatment. Now, shock is definitely injurious at all ages and in all conditions of life. All types of shock are injurious. But the shock treatment results in hemorrhages into the brain. It results in damages of brain cells. And at autopsy, the brain of a person who has received considerable shock treatment resembles a sponge. So much damage has been done to that brain, and so many blood clots have been formed in that brain as a consequence of the shock. It is quite true that occasionally somebody makes a temporary recovery from their condition in spite of shock. just as people are continually making partial and temporary recoveries from various other conditions in spite of crucifying treatment of all kinds. And they've been doing it all down the ages, no matter what the form of treatment. But it is also true that these people who apparently recover from their mental troubles as a consequence of shock or in spite of shock have relapses sooner or later and are back in the institution for more shock treatment. Ultimately, the case becomes hopeless. That kind of treatment would make a person insane who was perfectly sane to start with. And if there are any of you who doubt it, I make just one suggestion which ought to relieve you of your doubts in a very short time, and that is, make of yourself a guinea pig and let them give you a series of shock treatments to see for yourself if they will not make you insane. Here we deal with the old method of producing one disease to cure another. Remember the old law of cure that the so-called scientific school of medicine paraded before the world for so many years. The law of cure that gave them the name allopath, which is merely a word coined from two Greek roots meaning another suffering. That law of cure was that contraries cure opposites. Contraria contraries cura. Contraries cure opposites. Then the homeopaths came upon the scene. They had an opposite kind of law of cure. And the word homeopathy is a coined word from two Greek roots which means a similar suffering. And their law of cure was similia similibus curantur, which simply means like cures like. Each of them were engaged in the practice of producing disease to cure disease. One produced a similar disease, the other an opposite disease, but they were both producing disease to cure disease. And believe it or not, both groups of them are still engaged in the same practice. Shocking people into sanity is merely trying to produce a case of insanity to cure insanity. I can't think of anything that is more illogical and more likely to damage the poor victim of the ancient superstition that diseases can and should be cured than this resort to shock treatment and insanity. But they go so far as to operate on the brain and remove part of the brain. I don't think that would make a great deal of difference to most people. From my experience, and I admit that it has been limited because caring for these cases requires special accommodations. They can't be kept with other patients. So that my experience has been limited, but it has also been sufficiently extensive to justify me in saying what I am about to say. From my experience in handling mental and nervous troubles, and I think I'm placing the emphasis tonight on mental troubles because we handle a lot of nervous cases all along, I believe firmly that if hygienists were admitted to the mental institutions of the country, I mean as practitioners now, not as patients, and given a free hand in the care of these cases, that instead of being compelled to build more and bigger hospitals in which to house the ever-growing army of mentally ill, that within 3 to 5 years we could close a great number of these institutions that are already overcrowded. I have no doubt of it. I have taken patients that escaped from mental institutions and were caught and dragged back screaming and clawing, trying to get away, for whom no hope was held out. And I have seen these patients recover in periods ranging from 3 to 9 months. One of my patients, it required 9 months to recover from her insanity after she escaped from the state hospital and was dragged back in the manner in which I have just described, later became the secretary of the mayor of San Antonio and served as had the reputation of being one of the finest secretaries in the city. I have seen a few cases that required longer than 9 months for recovery, and I've seen a number that required a much shorter time than 9 months, as little as 3 for recovery. And I know one man that, after he recovered from a state of insanity at my place, became a well-known radio commentator. I won't tell you his name, because you might think that he hasn't recovered yet. Now, I believe in gentle measures of handling the sick, and I would not think of staking out a patient, a mental patient, tying him with a rope or a chain and staking him out on the grounds. I would not think of abusing him and beating him as they do, or of dosing him with narcotics to keep him quiet. I know that a patient that is quiet and that is unconscious is easily handled, and he is no trouble to the attendant and to the physician in charge. But he is certainly not recovering his health. He is certainly not being supplied with any of the requirements of health. And this kind of treatment certainly removes none of the causes of his trouble. Nor is there any effort made in mental institutions to remove causes. The tranquilizers that are so commonly used today merely keep the patients quiet and enable them to talk to them, as though you can talk sick cells into a state of health. It's as silly to think that you can talk sick cells into health as it is to think that you can shock them into good health. Sick cells, whether they're brain cells or liver cells, can get well when the causes of their sickness is removed and the requisites of health are supplied, and they cannot get well in any other way. I have already mentioned to you in some of my previous lectures cases of paralysis, which is a nerve disease. Sometimes it involves brain centers rather than nerve centers, that have recovered under my care, and I can tell you those of others that have recovered under other care. And I know from a vast experience with nervous conditions, as distinct from what we call mental conditions, that nervous cases can and do get well if they're properly cared for. Now, there is a young man living in a city not too many million miles away that has made 14 trips to my place. The last one, the 14th trip, when he arrived, I told him, I will not accept you. He stayed for anywhere from 1 to 3 days each time he came, and then he'd go back home. One time, he did stay 2 weeks. He probably needs about 6 months to recover from his troubles. We call him a neurotic, which merely means that he is liable to development of nervous symptoms or so-called nervous diseases. But when a patient doesn't give you, or himself, I should say, any more opportunity of recovery than this young man does, there is no possibility of him recovering. And after dealing with him for so many times, when he came back the 14th time, I said, I will not accept you. You're wasting my time, you're wasting your money, or rather, your mother's money, and we're not going to involve your mother in any more expense. So, he got a job teaching dancing. I think he's still there in the city. But he probably, well, there is even a possibility that someday he'll make a partial recovery in spite of everything, because people are continuously doing it. Old Mother Nature is bringing about recovery all the time. The operation of the healing forces of the body are in continuous day and night operation throughout our lives. And they sometimes restore us to a fair state of health, not to genuine health, in spite of our violations of the laws of life. Now, I believe that I have used up all of my time, and I'm going to ask the chairman for just a minute more to give you, I have been requested by some of the people at the book counter back there to give you some definitions. I am told that you look at some of the titles of books back there and you get frightened and run. I bet you that if I ask you what the meaning of the word and, A-N-D, is, that most of you would say, well, it's a preposition, and you wouldn't tell me its meaning. You use it every day, and most of the time at least, you use it correctly, without actually being able to define it. It is a big word to a child. Big words are not big anymore after you become acquainted with them. They're just as small, if they have 20 letters in them, as 3-letter words are, after you become acquainted with them, after you know their meaning. And yet so many of us are so brain lazy that we run from words. There are 3 titles of 3 of my books there that they tell me people are running from, and they ask me to explain those titles. The first one is orthobionomics. Ortho is a Greek root meaning correct, true, upright. And bionomics is also from the Greek, and it means the adaptation of life to its environment. Orthobionomics is a term that I coined to mean correct adaptation. You can adapt yourself to unfavorable conditions. You can adapt yourself to tobacco and to alcohol, but these are not correct adaptations. Orthobionomics is a word to express correct adaptation of life to its environment. Then there is the word orthotrophy. Again, the ortho means correct or true or upright, and trophy is a Greek word meaning food or nutrition. The word simply means correct nutrition. Then there is orthokinesiology. You won't find it in the dictionary, but you'll find the word kinesiology, which means the science of movement. It is a word that is applied to exercise, corrective and otherwise. And ortho means the science of correct movement, orthokinesiology. They're really very simple, although they look very big when you first see them. You may have the chair now, Mr. Chairman.
Why would one malted milk drink bring on immediate recurrence of severe insanity?
One malted milk drink would not bring on an immediate recurrence of insanity. But you've all heard the old saying that it's the last straw that breaks the camel's back. It really isn't. It is the last straw added to all the other straws that have been piled on the poor camel's back that makes the load so heavy that the back breaks. So one malted milk drink added to all the other things that your supposed recovered case has been subjected to may be enough to bring on the insanity. But a truly healthy individual, even though he was once insane, may take a dozen malted milk drinks, and he shouldn't, but he may, without becoming insane again.
Why does a disease affect a certain organ and not the whole body at once? Example, headache or anything instead of the whole body paining.
Well, now, in the first place, disease doesn't affect the body. There isn't any such thing as disease to affect the body. We ought to stop talking in medical terms if we want to understand hygiene. If we want to understand life, let us get away from all voodooistic conceptions of life and of disease and of health and of healing. Headache is disease. Now, what does the word disease mean? Just stop and analyze it. D-I-S, dis, means the absence of something in this case. Ease, the absence of ease. And a headache really is an absence of ease. Headache is due to a toxic state of the body. There may be anemia, but the anemia is preceded by toxemia. There may be nervous exhaustion, but there's also toxins. Headache may be produced by pressure in the rectum. It may be constipation. Or you may stuff cotton into the rectum and produce a headache by pressure from stuffing the cotton into the rectum. Headache may be due to indigestion from nervous irritation in the stomach. From irritation of the stomach by rotting food. Headaches are symptoms. But don't think that a symptom is only local. That headache may be due to something far away from the head. The entire body is involved in every so-called disease. And if you have a severe headache and you feel good all over except your head, you are a very exceptional individual.
This concludes cassette number 30.